Welcome to Ahmed's World Time Trick, where we explore the history of 19th and 20th century Cuba before Fidel Castro. In this brief introduction, we'll take a glimpse into these transformative periods that set the stage for Castro's rise to power, shaping the course of Cuba's history. Join us as we embark on this historical journey, uncovering the events and influences that paved the way for Fidel Castro's Cuba. In 1808, King Ferdinand VII of Spain was captured by Napoleon Bonaparte during the Peninsular War. This led to a power vacuum in Cuba, as Ferdinand's father, King Charles IV, had abdicated the throne in his favor. The Spanish government in exile established a regency to rule Cuba in Ferdinand's absence. However, the regency was weak and ineffective, and it was unable to maintain control over the island. This power vacuum created an opportunity for Cuban nationalists to assert themselves. In 1810, a group of Cuban intellectuals and landowners established a junta in Havana. The junta called for the establishment of an autonomous government for Cuba. The Spanish Regency responded to the junta by sending a military force to Cuba. The junta was defeated, and its leaders were imprisoned or exiled. Despite its defeat, the junta's actions showed that there was a growing movement for independence in Cuba. The power vacuum created by Ferdinand's capture also made it clear that Spain was no longer able to effectively control the island. The 10 Years' War was the first major war of independence fought by the Cuban people against Spain. The war began on October 10, 1868, when Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, a wealthy Cuban planter, freed his slaves and launched an uprising in the town of Yara. Céspedes called for the abolition of slavery and the establishment of an independent Cuban republic. The war was long and bloody, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. The Spanish army was initially more powerful than the Cuban rebels, but the rebels were able to wage a guerrilla war that made it difficult for the Spanish to defeat them. The war ended in a stalemate in 1878, and the Zaandam Pact was signed on February 10, 1878. The pact granted Cuba some concessions, such as the abolition of slavery and the creation of a Cuban House of Representatives. However, the pact did not grant Cuba independence. The Second War of Independence began on February 24, 1895, when José Martí, a Cuban poet and revolutionary leader, landed in Cuba with a small group of rebels. Martí was killed in a skirmish with Spanish forces soon after his arrival, but the war continued. The Second War of Independence was even bloodier than the 10 Years' War. The Spanish army used scorched earth tactics to try to defeat the rebels, and they concentrated thousands of Cubans in reconcentration camps. The reconcentration camps were notorious for their squalid conditions and high death tolls. In 1898, the United States intervened in the Second War of Independence, leading to the Spanish-American War. The United States was motivated to intervene by a number of factors, including economic interests, humanitarian concerns, and a desire to expand its influence in the Caribbean. The United States quickly defeated Spain in the Spanish-American War. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Paris on December 10, 1898. The treaty granted Cuba its independence from Spain. Cuba gained its independence from Spain on December 10, 1898. However, Cuba's independence was not complete. The United States occupied Cuba from 1898 to 1902, and the Platt Amendment, which was included in the Cuban Constitution in 1901, gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Cuba remained under U.S. influence for many years after its independence. Despite the challenges it faced, Cuba made significant progress in the 19th century. The island's economy grew, its population increased, and its culture flourished. the Cuban people also developed a strong sense of national identity. Tomás Estrada Palma takes office as president. Cuba's sovereignty was compromised by the Platt Amendment. The key provisions of the Platt Amendment are as follows. Cuban independence. The amendment acknowledged Cuba's independence from Spain but granted the United States the authority to intervene in Cuban affairs to protect its interests. Naval base. The United States was granted the right to maintain a naval base in Cuba, which resulted in the establishment of the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. This base has remained a source of contention between the two countries. Intervention and control. The amendment authorized the United States to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve Cuban independence, maintain law and order, and protect American lives and property. It effectively gave the United States considerable control over Cuba's internal and external affairs. Treaty obligations. The Cuban government was required to include the Platt Amendment as part of its constitution, and had to agree to certain treaty obligations with the United States. The Platt Amendment significantly limited Cuban sovereignty and autonomy, as it allowed the United States to exert substantial influence over Cuban politics, economy, and foreign relations. It was met with resistance and opposition from many Cubans who viewed it as a violation of their independence. The Platt Amendment remained in effect until 1934, when it was formally abrogated through the Cuban-American Treaty of Relations. However, its impact on U.S.-Cuba relations and Cuban history has been long-lasting, shaping the dynamics between the two countries for many years to come. Cuba entered a new era with aspirations of economic prosperity. The sugar industry, which had long been the backbone of the Cuban economy, continued to play a significant role. However, the transition to independence brought both opportunities and challenges for the industry and other major sectors. Cuban investors faced difficulties in developing and operating large sugar factories due to limited resources, leading to a heavy reliance on foreign investment. This reliance meant that foreign interests, primarily from the United States, exerted significant control over the sugar industry. As a result, Cuba's economic landscape remained heavily influenced by external forces. Despite aspirations for economic autonomy, the Cuban government struggled with weak governance and widespread corruption in the early years of independence. This weakened the government's ability to regulate foreign-owned companies effectively and ensure fair taxation. Consequently, many Cubans felt a growing sense of resentment towards foreign control over their country's key industries. Initially, the occupation was welcomed by many Cubans who sought stability and an end to violence. However, as time went on, the U.S. began imposing its own policies, leading to growing discontent among the Cuban population. The U.S. government's support for the suppression of the Liberal Party rebellion further alienated many Cubans. Under the leadership of Charles Edward Magoon, the provisional governor of Cuba, the U.S. implemented reforms and invested in Cuba's infrastructure. New institutions such as a police force, judicial system, and sanitation initiatives were established. While these reforms brought some improvements, the occupation also gave rise to corruption and crime. In 1908, the U.S. held elections in Cuba, resulting in the victory of the Conservative Party. Subsequently, the U.S. withdrew its troops in 1909. However, the Platt Amendment, included in the Cuban Constitution, allowed the U.S. to maintain a significant influence over Cuban affairs. The second U.S. occupation of Cuba remains a subject of debate. While some saw it as a necessary evil to restore stability, others viewed it as a violation of Cuban sovereignty. The occupation left a lasting impact on Cuba and its relationship with the United States for decades to come. While the U.S. occupation initially aimed to restore stability and protect American interests, it inadvertently led to several adverse outcomes. One such consequence was the U.S. government's support for the Cuban government's suppression of the Liberal Party rebellion. This support, intended to maintain order, ultimately alienated many Cubans who sought political freedom and reform. Additionally, the occupation witnessed an unfortunate rise in corruption and crime. While the U.S. implemented reforms to improve governance and infrastructure, The presence of foreign forces and the disruption caused by the occupation created an environment conducive to illicit activities. Cuba was valuable to the U.S. for trade and investment. Supporting friendly leaders ensured favorable conditions for American businesses. Geopolitical importance: Cuba's strategic location in the Caribbean was crucial for U.S. influence in the region. Supporting pro-American leaders helped maintain control and counter potential threats. U.S. support aimed to protect American lives and investments in Cuba by backing leaders who maintain stability and order. During the Cold War, the U.S. opposed communism. It supported leaders like Batista who opposed communist ideologies. Cuban presidents supported by USA government were Tomás Estrada Palma, 1902 to 1906. Palma served as the first president of independent Cuba, following the end of the Spanish-American War. He sought to balance the interests of the United States and Cuba, but American intervention in Cuban affairs was not uncommon during his presidency. Mario Garcia Menecal, 1913 to 1921. Menecal assumed the presidency after winning the 1912 election. He had pro-American leanings and increased U.S. influence in Cuba during his tenure. However, his administration was also marked by a crackdown on dissent and corruption. While the United States supported Menecal's government, concerns about his authoritarian tendencies grew over time. Gerardo Machado, 1925 to 1933. Machado came to power through a coup and established a dictatorial regime in Cuba. His presidency was marred by corruption, repression, and brutality against his opponents. The United States initially supported Machado's government but withdrew its support in 1933 due to his increasingly oppressive rule. Fulgencio Batista, 1933 to 1944 and 1952 to 1959. Batista rose to power through a military coup in 1933 and served as Cuba's president during two separate periods. While his first term was marked by some democratic reforms, his second term, 1952 to 1959, was characterized by authoritarianism, corruption, and human rights abuses. Despite these issues, the United States maintained support for Batista throughout his reign. Under Batista's rule, Cuba undergoes a dramatic transformation. His regime, known for its authoritarian tendencies, cracks down on dissent and stifles political opposition. The country becomes a playground for the wealthy elite, while the majority of the population struggles to make ends meet. As the divide between the haves and the have-nots widens, a growing sense of frustration and discontent simmers beneath the surface. The Cuban people yearn for change, for a leader who will champion their rights and restore dignity to the nation. During the reign of Fulgencio Batista, Cuba experienced a dark chapter in its history, marked by widespread horror and oppression. Under Batista's regime, the Cuban people endured unimaginable hardships and paid a heavy price for his authoritarian rule. Batista's grip on power was characterized by a ruthless suppression of dissent and a disregard for basic human rights. His security forces, notorious for their brutality, unleashed a reign of terror upon the people, silencing any opposition through intimidation, imprisonment, and even murder. Political prisoners were subjected to unspeakable acts of torture, often in secret detention centers where their cries for justice went unheard. Many individuals who dared to speak out against the regime simply vanished, their families left to wonder about their fate. While Batista consolidated his power, a stark contrast emerged between the privileged few who thrived under his regime and the vast majority of Cubans who lived in poverty and despair. Corruption ran rampant, with wealth and influence concentrated in the hands of a select few, while the rest struggled to make ends meet. The Cuban people, burdened by social injustice and economic hardships, could no longer bear the weight of Batista's oppressive regime. They took to the streets, engaging in protests, strikes, and acts of resistance, seeking to reclaim their rights and demand a better future. Eduardo Chivas was a Cuban politician and radio personality. He is best known for his populist and anti-corruption rhetoric. Chivas was a vocal critic of Fulgencio Batista, the Cuban dictator who ruled the country from 1933 to 1959. Chivas was born in Santiago de Cuba, Cuba. He studied law at the University of Havana, but he left school to pursue a career in radio. Chivas became a popular radio personality, and he used his platform to attack corruption in the Cuban government. Chivas founded the Partido Ortodoxo, Orthodox Party. The Ortodoxo Party was a populist party that called for social justice and an end to corruption. Chivas became the party's presidential candidate. Batista launched a coup and overthrew the Cuban government. Chivas was devastated by the coup. He believed that the Cuban people had been betrayed. On August 5, 1951, Chivas shot himself in the chest during his weekly radio broadcast. Chivas died the next day. Chivas's death was a major blow to the Cuban opposition movement. He was a popular and respected figure, and his death inspired many Cubans to join the fight against Batista. Chivas is considered to be a martyr of the Cuban Revolution. It was in this atmosphere of suffering and despair that Fidel Castro emerged as a beacon of hope. He rallied the disenchanted, inspired by a vision of a more just and egalitarian society. Castro's call for revolution resonated with the people, igniting a flame of resistance that would eventually bring down the Batista regime. Join us in the next chapter as we explore the revolutionary Cuba under Fidel Castro's rule, witnessing the challenges, achievements, and enduring legacy of the Cuban Revolution.